Hello, and welcome to the American Association for Advancement of Science webinar on non-traditional careers in STEM. We're delighted that you could join us today. So my name is Mary Ann Leung, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. And I am the founder and president of Sustainable Horizons Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the development of the scientific workforce with a particular interest in diversity and inclusion. My background is in computational chemistry. I received a bachelor's degree from Mills College in chemistry with a minor in mathematics, and then master's and PhD degrees at the University of Washington. And I'm super happy and delighted to be here and to kind of be your leader for this journey through this very interesting webinar on non-traditional careers. So the agenda for today is that we have 4 panelists, distinguished panelists that are lined up here to talk to you about regulatory science, science policy, science communication, and patent law. So we will then have some takeaways and closing remarks that I will give to you at the end and summarize. So before we get started, I want to just mention a couple things. So this webinar is being hosted by the AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the National Science Division of Human Resources. It is associated with the Emerging Researchers National Conference in STEM, which is a fabulous conference that's organized every year and brings in thousands of people from across the United States to come together and have a great time. And in particular, it's targeted at college and university undergraduate and graduate students who participated in programs funded by the NSF HRD unit. And it definitely includes underrepresented minorities and people with disabilities. So the ERN conference provides STEM majors a chance to present their research, participate in professional development and a great educational fair. It will be held in February the 21st through the 23rd in 2019 in Washington, D.C. So it's an opportunity to come to a great city and see the nation's capital. The abstracts for submission and travel awards, the deadline is coming up. It's right around the corner on October 12th. So you still have time to try to apply to come and present your research and get a travel award. So if you'd like more information, there's a URL here. It's newemergingresearchers.org. So go and visit and learn more about the conference. And if you're ready, put in an application. So this session today is part of a webinar series to share information about resources on STEM careers and options and career paths. So there are more webinars coming up as well. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple things regarding the webinar, kind of how it's set up and etiquette for using this webinar. So you may have noticed that all the attendees are automatically muted, so you cannot, your voice will not be projected into this session. However, we're planning this to be a very interactive sessions, so we do want to have you interacting with us. The organization will be, the panelists will each have 10 minutes to talk about their particular field. And then after each panelist, there will be 3 minutes for questions and answers. You can ask your questions a couple of different ways. There's a questions box, which you can see I brought up here, and you can just type in your question and send that question in, and then we'll catch it and we'll read it for you. Or you can click the raise your hand button to ask your question with your own voice and your own word. To do this, you must have a microphone or be connected by the telephone, and please wait till you're called. So you're automatically muted. When we see you raise your hand, we will call on you and then we will unmute you. So here's that little raise your hand button that you can click if you want to ask your question yourself. There are also some poll questions kind of spread throughout this webinar so that we can get some input from you and you can ask questions and have more opportunities for interactivity. If there's time permitting at the very end, we will also have a little Q&A session after all the panelists have presented their information. And just as a tip, if you do have questions while the panelists are presenting their material, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand or type your question into the question box so you can be in the queue and we'll be ready to go with your questions as soon as the panelist is completed. Okay, with that, we will go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask a poll question about your academic status. So please answer, what is your academic status? The responses are A, undergraduate student, B, graduate student, C, faculty, D, STEM professor, or other. So we're going to share the poll now, and so you can go ahead and answer the poll question. So again, what you can see is you should be able to answer the question. Let's see. Okay, good. So the poll is in progress. Please just indicate whether you're an undergraduate student, a graduate student, you're in the faculty or some other STEM professional, or just have some other category. No right answer here. We're just trying to collect information about who's out there and what your background is. And also, this is an opportunity for you to practice using the poll. Okay, it looks like we have most people who have voted. So let's go ahead and show the poll responses, just so everyone can see it. And there we go. Here we go. So you can see that we have quite a few graduate students. Also undergraduates, faculty, STEM staff. We have a good distribution, but it seems like at the moment we have the largest percentage are graduate students. Okay, great. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. We will go ahead and continue on with the presentation, so we can take off the poll. Okay, great. So next we're ready to introduce our first panelist, who is Dr. Angela Whatley, who's a biologist and scientific reviewer at the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Whatley received her PhD in microbiology from the University of Missouri and has a strong record of leading the next generation of scientists and increasing diversity in STEM. She is the DMV director of the Black Women in Science and Engineering, and organized an organization focused on bridging the leadership gap for Black women in STEM, and she mentors scientists at many career levels and paths. Additionally, she has been a peer mentor for the Federal Associations for Experimental Biology, and while graduate student, she started a minority graduate student organization. She's a biologist at the Food and Drug Administration Association in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and serves as a product reviewer in the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies. She reviews chemistry, manufacturing, and controls for various gene therapy submissions and advises industry and academic sponsors on how they can improve manufacturing and testing to be compliant with FDA regulations. Prior to joining the FDA, Angela was a program specialist at the Department of Veterans Affairs and managed scientific merit review, regulatory compliance, budget analysis, and strategic planning for $23 million a year Quality Enhancement Research Initiative program. In 2012, Angela became a Presidential Management Fellow in the Office of Research and Development at the VA, where she analyzed scoring variations between scientific review committees, how academic rank and gender impact merit review success rates, and health disparities and comparative effectiveness. So before we get started with Dr. Whatley's presentation, I'm going to do another quick poll. And this poll asks, how much scientific training do you think is required for a regulatory position? So let's go ahead and push out the poll. And the answers are very little for A, B is some, C is a moderate amount, and D is extensive. So just take a guess. Obviously, we don't expect you to have already know the answers to this, because hopefully that's why you're here, is to learn about regulatory fields. But just take a guess. What do you think? How much scientific training is required for a regulatory position? So again, how much scientific training is required for a regulatory position? Very little, some, a moderate amount, or an extensive amount? Okay, it looks like most people have voted. So I think we'll go ahead and close the poll and show the results. And you can see that most people think a moderate amount is required for a regulatory position. Well, so this is a really interesting question, and I'm sure we're going to find out in the next few minutes as Dr. Whatley tells us about what it's like to be in a regulatory position in science. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Whatley, and please go ahead. I think you're still on mute.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful introduction, Marianne. And I'm going to be talking today about regulatory career paths, and specifically my path to becoming a reviewer here at FDA. So here's the outline of my talk today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of my background. Then I'll go over some of what I do in my current position, and then I'll finish by talking a little bit about federal STEM fellowship opportunities. So this slide highlights my background. As Marianne said, I received my PhD in microbiology from the University of Missouri. I have a bachelor's in biology from Rockhurst University. Both of these are in Missouri. After finishing graduate school, I did the Presidential Management Fellows Program. That's a 2-year competitive fellowship for people with advanced degrees looking to get into the government. It's an entry-level leadership program. And I was at the VA for about 3.5 years. And then in 2016, I transitioned to FDA. And at FDA, I work in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls in the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies. So this slide highlights the background of my office. So we are in the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Food and Drug Administration regulates foods and drugs, and as well as drugs for animals. And then the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research regulates biologic drugs, and the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies regulates specific types of biologics. And this is our division, and I'm actually a biologist in the gene therapy branch. So I also wanted to go over the FDA definition of gene therapy. And gene therapy are products that mediate their effect by transcription or translation of transferred genetic material, or by specifically altering host genetic sequences. So some common examples of these are shown in the slides. They include plasmids, viral vectors, bacterial vectors, and these can be ex vivo, genetically modified cells, or engineered nucleases, or for genome editing, such as CRISPR. So gene therapies primarily work by 2 different ways. It can be done either ex vivo or in vivo, and this slide highlights the administration route. So with ex vivo administration, cells are taken from the body, and then they are transduced with the DNA, RNA, or sometimes a lentiviral vector, and those vectors genetically modify the cells, and then those modified cells are then introduced back into the body, and that is how the effect works. So there are also in vivo gene therapy routes, and some examples include AAV, adeno-associated virus, or lipid nanoparticles, and these are administered directly to the subject. So this slide just highlights 2 different ways by which gene therapies can be administered. So the gene therapy field has been advancing rapidly. In the past year, we at FDA approved 3 gene therapies, and they're shown here, 2 for different types of cancers and 1 for a genetic form of blindness. So it's been a really exciting time to be in the gene therapy field here at FDA. So this slide illustrates the regulatory framework that we use at FDA. As you may know, everything the FDA does is grounded in laws, and these laws are passed by Congress. So our work aims to support the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Acts, as well as the Public Health Service Act. And those are the 2 laws shown at the bottom. But these laws can be very broad in scope. So in order to narrow the scope, regulate the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs, are used. So 21 CFRs are what we use here at FDA, and shown here are some of the most common sections that we use, the regulations that we use to enforce the laws. So these regulations can also be very broad. So here at FDA, we release guidance documents which represent our current thinking on topics at the time. So shown here are some 3 guidance documents that were released recently in the gene therapies branch. 1 for CMC for gene therapy INDs, human gene therapy for hemophilia, and long-term follow-up for gene therapy. So as you can see, these guidance documents can be narrower in focus, and they provide potential applicants who want to submit regulatory files to FDA a framework of our current thinking on specific topics. So this slide highlights the drug development process. So depending on what type of research you've done, you may be familiar with basic research. And this is understanding mechanisms of actions or how things work at the basic level. And then as those things advance, you may find a specific prototype or design, and then it may develop through clinical trials through stage 1, 2, and 3, and eventually potentially to FDA approval. So throughout the drug development process, people can apply to us and request specific meetings with the FDA to get feedback regarding their development process. So shown here at the bottom these are the times when sponsors can actually apply to have a meeting with FDA. And my primary job is to review these submissions. So each time a sponsor is at a step and they want to have a meeting with FDA, they will submit a packet to us, and I help review this packet. Okay, so here are some of the reasons why I love my job. Is cutting edge science. The products that we review are very innovative. They're constantly changing, so it's never a dull or a dry day. There's constantly things developing. As I said, we work on things that are doing things that we just hoped about 10 years ago, but now some of these gene therapies are really doing wonderful things, and we get to help contribute to that. And there's also an impact on public health. So we take great pride in ensuring public health and helping contribute to that. And there's a lot of professional development opportunities to advance both at FDA and to grow and learn more about different opportunities. It's a great positive environment here, and there's lots of opportunities to try different things out, to do detail assignments where you try out a new role. And it's a very diverse place to work, and the work-life balance is great. So these are some of the reasons why I love my position here at FDA. So if this sounds like an interesting career path, I know I've just given a very broad overview, and I'm trying to leave enough time for questions if there are any. So some of the important things you want to do is you want to make a plan, because these jobs can be very competitive. There's a lot of people who would like to work in regulatory work. So you need to make a plan, and this can be difficult for a graduate student to try to balance the demands of graduate school with planning for what's next. So become familiar with USA Jobs, and you can do things like create a search in USA Jobs, and you can save your search. You can receive notifications anytime a job comes open, and it's applicable to your search terms, and you should learn how to answer the questionnaires on USA Jobs. And this is pertinent to looking for any kind of federal job, but most jobs at FDA are advertised there, and you should get familiar with USA Jobs if you're interested in working at FDA. Another thing you want to do is network. You want to use both online tools such as LinkedIn, and you also want to look at professional societies, university contacts, or conferences, and try to find other people who are doing similar things. And you want to do informational interviews with them to learn about their career path, such as this webinar that you're doing today. But you want to learn what different people are doing, how they got there, and possibly try to follow their path, or create your own path. So another thing that I wanted to talk about very briefly was the federal fellowships for STEMs. So a lot of people have heard of the AAAS fellowship, and listed here is that one, as well as some of the other fellowships that are available for people with STEM backgrounds. And a lot of these fellowships are very competitive to get into, but this is a very likely way that a lot of people get into federal service is by doing one of these fellowships first. So if you're interested in a regulatory career or any career in the federal government, I would highly encourage you to look at some of the fellowships listed here or other ones. And these fellowships, although they are hard to get, some of them can be hard to get into. There are ways to do it, and one way is to plan. And here's an outline of a potential spreadsheet that one of my mentees created. And this is just a spreadsheet she created to keep track of all the different fellowships that she wanted to apply to. And creating something like this for yourself, just listing the specific fellowship, the link, and the application, when it's open, when it's closed, and what type of requirements there are. This can be helpful because there's a lot of different fellowships, and the timelines can be very tight. So doing something like this can really help you if you're interested in this sort of career path. So in summary, regulatory careers are an exciting way to use your scientific training and impact public health. And getting into a regulatory career can be challenging, but it can be done if you plan accordingly and network, and this will improve your chances of getting a regulatory position. So now I would like to open it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Whatley, for that really engaging presentation. I know it was a quick overview of your field, but it was very exciting. I'm sure a lot of people have never heard about this field before. I see we already have some questions, so I'm going to go ahead and read one to you. The first question is from Eric, and the question is, how much does your job change with a new administration? Is it a safe bet to get into regulatory work when this seems to be a real area that, let's see if I can see the rest of it. The question got cut off. So anyways, the question is, how much does your job change with a new administration?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So a lot of some things do change as far as from one administration to another, what the emphasis are. But I think that the larger scientific community realizes the valuable work that we do here at FDA. So we have been very busy as this field has evolved and things have continued to grow. The administration has slightly altered. They may have specific focuses, but the job of protecting public health is still vital to every administration, and our work has continued. So at levels above my pay grade, they may be more influenced by changes in administration, but at this level, what I'm primarily focused on is what does the science say, and we really try to use a science-based approach to regulatory work. And administration to administration, the science doesn't really change much. Things advance, but we really try to stay grounded in the science. And there may be different emphasis, but we try to just continue to help promising therapies, help patients get access to promising therapies, and help ensure that things are safe.
Great, thank you. I have another question, and that is, what is the FDA's stand on hiring international graduate students? How is that process different?
So that's a very interesting question. So it definitely depends on which pathway you want to use. There are some fellowships and opportunities that are open to international students, and I would encourage you to look at the FDA's website and USA.gov in order to learn about different fellowships that are open. I do know several people who work at FDA who have entered the organization via fellowships who are international students.
Okay, great, thank you. One more question, and this question is, how has your life science research background been useful in your current role?
So that's a very interesting question. So it's been directly applicable. So my PhD is in microbiology, and I was using RNA aptamers to inhibit HIV. And here at FDA, I'm looking at gene therapy. So I'm looking at the same sort of cell lines. I'm using a lot of virology, microbiology, immunology. So a lot of the same skill sets that I was using, I'm using now. A lot of the things that I learned in graduate school, I'm directly applying in the framework of the regulatory work. So you have to understand the science in order to do this sort of job, because you have to know what the products are and how they're being made and how they're being manufactured. And those are the sort of things that you learn in graduate school, and you just apply them to current therapies.
Okay, great. So I have a question myself. I'm just curious, what inspired you to go into regulatory work?
Right. So one thing that inspired me is the idea of contributing to public health and helping things advance. So these things are very exciting opportunities, and there's things that are happening now, and the idea of being able to contribute to that is very exciting, and the potential to influence that and make an impact. Those are my top reasons for going into this career path, to help ensure that these things are safe.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Whatley. It is time for us to move on. So we're going to go ahead and hopefully there'll be some time at the end if people have more questions for you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next panelist, which is Dr. Elizabeth Zittler. And she is a science senior program officer at the Board on Energy and Environmental Systems at the National Academies of Science and Engineering. She directs expert committees that advise on critical energy issues for the nation, including studies and convenings on vehicle energy efficiency, electricity sector, and energy environment systems. Primary project is directing a study of vehicle energy efficiency technologies to inform the US DOT fuel economy regulations. She also produces studies on issues of energy science and technology of significance to the government, industry, nonprofits, and the public. Her current focus areas include light-duty vehicle energy efficiency technology and policy, electric vehicle technology and deployment and energy deployment on federal lands. So again, before we turn it over to Dr. Zittler, I'm going to ask another poll question. So we can go ahead and push out the poll question. And this question is about science policy roles. Again, we're asking you before you've heard the presentation, but just take a guess and see what roles do you think are most important for effective science policy? So your choices are government officials, academic researchers, industry leaders, or nonprofit organizations. What roles do you think are most important for effective science policy? Go ahead and answer the poll. Just select A, B, C, or D. Just take a wild guess and see what you think is the most important for science policy roles. For effective science policy, what roles do you think are most important? Government officials, academic researchers, industry leaders, nonprofit organizations. Give you just a couple more seconds so that you can continue voting. just take a wild guess. No, you're not gonna get asked, graded on this quiz or anything like that. We're just trying to gauge what you know about Science Poly before you actually hear about it. Okay, it looks like most people had voted, so let's go ahead and push out the results. And it looks like there's a few more people think that academic researchers are more important, and then the next, of course, is government officials. So that's very interesting, and what we're going to find out next in the presentation from Dr. Zitler is which of these roles are most important. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Zitler. Thank you so much in advance for your presentation. Just as a reminder, if during your while the presentation is going on, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter them into the question box or raise your hand, and we will call on you at the end. So I'm ready to pass it off to Dr. Zitler, and she can present her slides.
Great. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, we can see them now.
All righty, I will go ahead and get started then. So first of all, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed Dr. Watley's presentation and learned a lot from it. So and endorse in general the Make a Plan advice. That's really helpful. So what you are hopefully seeing right now is my title slide. It's mostly got some photos of some of the work that I've done working in science policy. And what I want to talk about today is scientists working in policy and how you might find your fit, because I think it's different for all different kinds of people. And I just wanted to note that I'm speaking for myself and not for the National Academy of Science or the Millennium Challenge Corporation. All righty. We're going to talk about what my work has been like primarily, but also some other paths that I've seen other people pursue in making science work for policy and vice versa. I'm going to talk about what I and others do in science policy, how I explored problems that were motivating to me, and what some roles are that you might find as a good fit. So what do scientists do in policy? So first of all, policy is how we approach a desired state from a current state. So some people work on approaching a desired state on policy for science. So that's how should we fund science? What are the topics we should work on? And some people instead explore providing science advice for policymakers. I've been primarily on the science advice for policymakers side, although I've done some policy for science as well. Scientists working in policy may provide technical advice, and they may also advise policymakers in context of working with other experts, and that's primarily my role. We do a lot of translating of science, engineering, and medicine into usable advice, and that's primarily what I do at the National Academies. And also, there's a lot of different short and long-term roles in this field, so we'll talk more about that later, but just know that you can dip in and out of science policy advice. It's very possible and actually really beneficial, I think, to both people's science and their policy work. So what I'm showing in the pictures here is a cover of a report that I contributed to called Overcoming Barriers to Deployment of Plug-in Electric Vehicles. My job was to staff this study. So what that meant is that I organized an expert committee to advise, in this case, DOE, on the topic of what are the barriers to electric vehicles and how do you move past those barriers from a technical standpoint, science and engineering side, and also from economics and other societal factors. I spent about 25% of my time at the academies writing with the committee, so helping these 10 or 15-person committees to write one report means you end up doing a lot of writing internally. I do a fair amount of research. I convene the experts, so literally get them on the phone, get them in the room. And then I spend about 25% of my time doing other stuff that includes managing my team and things like that. And in terms of writing and research, one of the things we get to do that's neat, I think, is think about problems that are maybe outside of your field, but that are also outside of the field of different committee members, kind of in that shared space of different people's understanding. So for example, the figure on the bottom of this slide is a pyramid that we put together when we were thinking about how people use different kinds of charging for their electric vehicles. And we tried to make this pyramid to help people understand that home charging was the most important kind of charging, and then that the second most important kind was workplace. And then above that is all the public charging facilities. And what we were trying to explain with this figure was that these have both different costs and amounts of involvement that the driver has to have, but also that they are time sensitive or insensitive, they're public or semi-public or private, so that there's different ways to think about those things. Then the second part of this, so I switched to a new slide that's got some new photos on it. I also worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and continue to consult with them. And what I've done there is advise on data for decisions. So I work with them on remote sensing data and transportation data, and on engaging with data communities worldwide. So at the top here is some OpenStreetMap information that we were using about a bridge that you can see a tiny photo in the kind of bottom left section of that map. This bridge in Kolda that MCC rehabilitated, and we were trying to understand how we could get better information about that without having to show up all the time. So then the bottom photo is an image of a women data science workshop that I was able to participate in collaboration with our data lab. And there's a link to the data lab on the first page. I should put one here too. They're a really neat group in Dar es Salaam that's funded by PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, although now they are running their own show and are self-funded and doing a lot of neat work on helping folks use data in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. All right, so I won't go through this whole detail, but the idea of this slide is to describe the path that I happen to take, and that doesn't mean that this is the best path for anyone else. But it started off with me getting a BA in chemistry. You'll note that I've talked a lot about transportation, and that should give you a bit of a pause because I definitely have only chemistry degrees. But that's a neat thing about working in science policy is your technical expertise in one area, you can grow that to have technical expertise in many different areas. So I got an undergrad degree at Scripps College. I did AmeriCorps. Then I went and worked in fundraising for a while, got my PhD, did a Mirzayan Fellowship, which may be interesting to folks who are interested in science policy fellowships. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then I worked at the National Academies, and I took a bit of kind of a sabbatical, more or less, to go work at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and now I'm back at the National Academies. And what I wanted to share here is that there were some formal education and training aspects of my work in school and in these fellowships. And then I also had employment aspects. And I think that my employment in the middle of all of this stuff has been really useful, both to actually get some work done, but even my fundraising employment at Catholic Charities really expanded how I thought about work and what I was doing with my life and how I might contribute. So you could say that I took a lot of initiative and I followed my curiosity to work on problems that had scientific needs and societal impact. But I was also very lucky to be met with opportunities to do that work and to work with other people. So I think that both those things are worth acknowledging. And again, I won't read every word that's on this slide, but I'll say that in undergrad, I was able to look at just very briefly the environmental justice aspects of air pollution work that I was doing on a scientific side. And that really helped me to learn more about the topic, but also to figure out how to talk with scientific mentors about that topic. Then in graduate school, I went back after doing some time out of formal education, and I went back to pursue energy, which I thought was the most important issue, and I continue to think is the most important issue that we are facing, and at least on the scientific side. And I learned a lot there. I was able to deepen my chemistry foundation, which I think is really critical to have a solid foundation in science. I think really improves your ability to offer policy advice. And then I was able to also connect with others and learn a lot. I went to Princeton for grad school, and I think that they have a really good network of people working in this area. And then I also got some fellowships that helped me to meet people as well. And then after graduate school, I became a Mirzayan Fellow and later a AAAS Fellow. And both of those fellowships are opportunities to experience providing science advice for policy. The Mirzayan Fellowship is 3 months long at the National Academies and incidentally open to non-US citizens. So explore that opportunity if you're not a US citizen or if you are. And then also the AAAS Fellowship, which Dr. Watley mentioned as well, and is Federal Government Science Policy Fellowship. There are many ways that people contribute to science for policy, and I want to emphasize that. So I've shown you how I got into this field, but some of the best people I work on with science policy work are professional scientists, either in industry or working in academia. They may be at national labs, they may even be in the government, and all those folks contribute to our knowledge of science and our ability to make decisions and help advise the government. I couldn't do what I do at the National Academies if I didn't have active experts in the field who are also willing to volunteer their time in this work. And some of them volunteer quite a lot of time, and some of them have shorter or less extensive commitments. So that's something that's worth exploring if you're interested. We've already talked some about these fellowships. There's AAAS fellowships. There's Jefferson Science Fellows at the State Department. And there's also not fellowships exactly, but different roles that people play at the National Science Foundation or at NASA, where they come in and temporarily offer science policy advice. So that's another way to think about it. And then finally, you may find that you just want to get a job in science policy. You don't want to do a fellowship. You don't want to be working in academic science or engineering anymore. So then you can explore different job roles. A lot of these are in non-governmental organizations. So there's science policy NGOs, there's environmental NGOs. You may find a government policy role that's a good fit for you. Or there's outside of science policy, there's people who offer policy advice that's relevant to science, either in issue-specific NGOs or for foundations or grant makers. So I just wanted to let folks know that that's available. So here's my take it with a grain of salt advice. I think it's most important that you get involved in the things you care about and find ways to lead in those areas. Try to make connections amongst people. I think that that really builds not only your network, but also builds the teams that you're going to need later on to be able to do your work. So it's not just about getting a job, but it's about being able to do what you think is important. And that counts, by the way, colleagues, mentors, sponsors, and just your friends. It's really good to have those relationships. Always ask questions at the talk. That's what I sit there thinking about during the talk, is what question I want to ask the speaker. Stick with your science education as far as you can, because having expertise is really the offer that you're going to bring to people. That's what you're going to be able to contribute to the team. And then look for different ways to be involved. Maybe you'll be the expert. Maybe you have the capability and connections to bring together the expert advice to the person who's making the decisions. And this is my summary slide. So now I'm able to take questions. And this just says what I've been saying all along, that you should follow your curiosity and connect with other people and stick with science and find a good way to do what you want to do.
Great, thank you very much. That was a really very interesting presentation. Well, we appreciate you sharing your pathway, because for a lot of people just don't know how you can even get there. So that's really wonderful that you shared that. So we'll open up for questions now. And again, you can type in your question into the question box, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you specifically if you'd like to ask it yourself. I'm just scrolling here, so please go ahead and raise your hand or type a question into the question box. So while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I will go ahead and ask a question. Again, I'm always curious, and I hate to ask the same questions, but I am curious about why you chose this particular path.
I've always been way too curious about way too many different things, and also wanting to make a difference in something that I thought was meaningful. And this is not to say that I don't think science is meaningful, because I think that scientific discoveries are really important and critical. But for me, some of the most important questions were in science policy, not in science. And it allows me, this particular path, especially at the National Academies, has allowed me to learn and do a lot of different things that I wouldn't have expected to get to be an expert in.
That's great. That sounds really interesting. So you had broad interest, it sounds like, and that's kind of why you followed this. Clearly, your path, you pursued a lot of opportunities employment-wise that really helped you to get to where you are now. I mean, you did a lot of work that kind of led you to where you are per se. I don't know if from the very beginning you really knew that this is exactly what you wanted to do. Okay, so it looks like we do have some questions coming in, so I'll go ahead and read them for you. The first one is, does your job description vary daily, or is it the same tasks each day?
Definitely varies. So some days I spend my whole day writing. Some days I'm in a whole day meeting where my full-time job is to make sure that two particular people have the right conversation, frankly. So it varies quite a bit, which is nice.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we have another question that came in, and someone's kind of curious to hear a little more about your experience at AmeriCorps, if you could expand on that.
Yeah, AmeriCorps is a domestic Peace Corps, and it's basically an opportunity for, I think you may have to be an American citizen or at least a resident, for folks to contribute to the national public good. And so my role there, it's something I'd wanted to do since I was maybe 15. I decided to do it after college, and I served in Baltimore City. Well, actually in Baltimore County. I lived in Baltimore City. And I was working with kids who are in the foster care system and in need of temporary treatment because they're having emotional and behavioral difficulties due to some, their past history, basically. And so it was a really neat opportunity to do a year of service and learn a whole ton and meet a lot of great people who luckily I still get to be close with because now I'm just a hop, skip, and a jump away here in DC. But yeah, I'd really encourage those service opportunities because I think you learn a lot about yourself and hopefully contribute something that's useful as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question that is kind of the same question that was asked in the last session. It seems like this is on a lot of people's mind. Do changes in the political administration affect your job very much?
Yes. So I work for the National Academy of Science, which doesn't sound like, it sounds like it's part of the government, but it's not. We are a chartered science advisor to the nation, essentially, founded back during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln decided he needed some science advice. So we have a national charter, but we're not part of the government. Although we do work hand in hand to answer policy and scientific questions for them. Those questions come from federal government agencies or from Congress, but they are always pretty much operated through federal government agencies. And so we have somewhat of a separate relationship with our funders because we want to have the independence that's important for our advice. But we do work with the administrations to do the different studies that we do. And so that's where things change a little bit with administrations. It's not even the administration necessarily, it's even just congressional changes mean that we have different questions that the government is asking us. And again, we are still an independent organization providing science advice. We provide that information publicly and without interference kind of once the process gets started, but the questions that are asked is what changes in administration.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, we do have some more questions, but unfortunately we have, I think in the interest of time, since we have 2 more speakers yet, we're gonna go ahead and move on. So I'm going to introduce our next panelist who's gonna talk about science communications, and that is Dr. Rafael Luna, who is an Associate Dean at the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences at Boston College. And Dr. Luna is the former Executive Director of Boston College National Research Mentoring Network. He came to Boston College after 11 years as a researcher, a teacher, and an administrator at Harvard Medical School. He started leading and advising a team that serves approximately 2,000 students and 100 alumni as they navigate the admissions process for graduate programs in medicine, dentistry, veterinary medicine, and other health professions. He earned his doctorate degree in biological sciences at Louisiana State University. And for the past year, he's led the National Institutes of Health funded NRMN, using data analytics to strategically grow that organization and travel extensively to universities and medical schools throughout the US to effectively reach 50 states and Puerto Rico. Operating at universities across the country, this organization is a multi-year mentoring initiative designed to advance underrepresented groups in the study of science, graduate study, careers, and ultimately as candidates for NIH and other government research funding. He's the first in his family to attend college. Luna said his work as an instructor at the Harvard Medical School helped him to realize his strengths in mentoring and advising. He initially entered the Biomedical Science Careers Program as a mentee. He was mentored by the BSCP president and Harvard Medical School professor Joan Reed, which led him to become a BSCP advisor and eventually a member of the executive board. He's been involved with that organization for more than 10 years, has worked with thousands of mentees throughout New England and the United States. He advises mentees to not only work in school and set their sights on graduate or professional schools, but also instructs them to on what he calls the invisible college, the primacy of relationships and networking in the development of careers in sciences and other disciplines. The hope is that mentees eventually become mentors themselves, wherein they themselves reach their goals and hence contribute to the mentoring cycle. So again, before we get started, I'm going to ask a quick poll question. Do you think there is a place for an antagonist in the scientific communication? So let's go ahead and push out this poll question so you can answer this. It's just a simple yes or no. And again, we're going to just ask you to guess. Do you think there's a place for an antagonist in scientific communication? Yes or no? So simple question, ask yes or no. Do you think there's a place for a scientific, an antagonist in scientific communication? All right, so in the interest of time, it looks like most of you have voted, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask for the poll results to be displayed. And the answer, it seems that most people do think that there's a role for an antagonist in scientific communication. So I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Luna so we can find out the answer to this question. Can't hear you, so I think you're still on muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, and we can see your slides as well, so great. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Marianne. It's really, I'm excited to be here. So in the interest of time, that was a great introduction, so let's go ahead and start understanding some storytelling regarding scientific communication. So it's difficult to publish or you hear the paradigm of publish or perish in academia. And it's difficult as a trainee or someone, a faculty member, how do you control the message? So in 2013, I wrote a book, The Art of Scientific Storytelling. And so I'm gonna give you a small glimpse of that here in the time allotted, and also talk about its impact on the work that I do. So in this book, we mentioned about one sentence scientific storytelling hypothesis, which every story, whether it's a PhD or a manuscript, a PhD dissertation or a manuscript that you're working on as a faculty member, or you're working on a paper as an undergrad, should have a protagonist, antagonist, conflict, scene, resolution, and stakes. Protagonist is the main character, and that's protagonist changes, and the antagonist stay the same. So, and it's between these two factors that the story develops, whether it's for a research paper or even aspects of the work that you do in scientific communication. The conflict is the problem, the scene where everything is happening. Resolution is, what happens as a result of that, and the stakes is research impact. And so if you see here, we have the C-terminal domain of eukaryotic initiation factor 5 is a protagonist. Promotes is the resolution form of a verb. The two antagonists are EIF1 and EIF2 beta. The conflict is dynamic interplay, and start codon recognition is the scene, happen on the 40S decoding box of the ribosome, and it's also the stakes because if we don't translate our proteins initially and faithfully with high fidelity, then life would cease to exist. And so along this vein, so we have a hypothesis, the eukaryotic initiation factor 5 promotes start codon recognition by its dynamic interplay with the EIF1 and 2 beta. That would be our hypothesis. And then we'll frame our experiments around that with T1, 2, and 3 being figures 1, 2, and 3, the climax figure 4, and figure 5 and 6 will be our validation experiments with the hypothesis resolved. And this is a paper that was published in 2012 using this method. And so we have a protagonist EIF5 and how it goes through its journey to really mediate and promote start codon recognition. And just to give another example, a cancer therapeutic target, here we have the question. So we have a protagonist and we have an antagonist. And so here we have a protagonist and an antagonist. But the key is, how do you identify which one is the protagonist, which one is the antagonist? So is it in gray, the eukaryotic initiation factor 4E, or is it the drug, the 4EGI1, which is in space-filled molecule? And the answer to that question would be EI4E is the protagonist, and the antagonist would be the space-filled molecule of the drug, which is 4EGI1. So if you look, when 4EGI1 binds, there's an extension of the alpha helix. You see right there, it extends. And so that lets you know that since the 4E changes, and while the 4EGI1 drug does not, then the protagonist is EI4E protein, which is quite important. It's quite difficult to do. And when we identify the protagonist, then a paper that was stuck for 2 years was put into overdrive and then was published in PNAS a couple months later. And so, how do we use scientific communication? So it showed you an example about using scientific storytelling for publishing research manuscripts, but then how can we use a transition from the bench? To publish a parish in academia is converted in scientific communication higher ed to shared governance or parish. It's still difficult to control the message for your work or programmatic initiative. And then I recommend that you calibrate your career story to impact institutional efforts. And you really do need evidence of service and committee work. So if you're using scientific communication as a vehicle to enter all these diverse fields, as you're hearing on from these distinguished panelists, then you would like to have evidence of your service and committee work that shows that provides a logical narrative for you getting to those careers. And scientists are highly skilled, so some of you are faculty members, graduate students based off the poll, and undergrad students. But so you're highly specialized in research training required over many years. And then you've been told, in the scientific field, have singular laser-like focus on scientific research. This is all that matters. You're working late in the lab and giving up your weekends, your early morning on weekends, and just working on your research. And then also, you typically want to be the first discovery in the lab. So some of the work you do is confidential, and so you don't typically share sometimes with other lab members or outside lab members until you publish your manuscript. And typically in science, you're rewarded for being the smartest person in the room. And quite honestly, you asked to serve on committees because you're an expert, subject matter expert. But how does this work with scientific communication? So specialized research training needs to be balanced with communicating and impacting a broad audience, consulting team members to get their buy-in, learn other areas rather quickly and act instead of having all the answers before you. And also in scientific communication, whether you're applying for a job or doing different things, it just takes time. Once you get the position, also to be successful in understanding that the time scale is different. You're not going to be able to work all weekend in the lab and to move a whole program initiative forward. It takes time. And so we have to understand that. And so to break this down a little bit further, you have the singular laser-like focus, and then maybe you can adapt that to, focus on one aspect of a time, and because you have multiple tasks and managing competing priorities with competing deadlines. And so just focus on one task at a time, typically, and complete that. So that in Germany, they have this phrase called eins nach dem anderen, and that's how you typically they train the German youth to really be successful, and it's the basis of German engineering, and that you do one step at a time and be successful at that. And so even though you might have a lot on your plate, you really do want to be successful with the individual tasks. So close the loop on administrative and leadership tasks as well. And typically, in research, you want to be the first to discovery, but how about being the first to help someone else on your team, across campus and other institutions? Something where it won't necessarily benefit you, but it can benefit others. That's the kind of character that requires being successful in different areas and fields. And also in scientific communication, requires transparency in decision making. So if you want to have a new initiative, you need to bring in all the key players and stakeholders and ask them what they think. And because that way, it's the teamwork that makes the dream work. So it's really important about building relationships. And you want to share the results of your initiatives with the stakeholders and give credit where credit is due and praise others in public, which is very important to be successful by using scientific communication. And also in science, you're rewarded, being the smartest person in the room, having the highest grade on the test or the exam. But in German, again, they say it's a Schlaumeier. So no one likes a smarty pants. And that's typically when you deal with others. Maybe it's great when you're in the lab and you're working by yourself. But when you're working with a team and a committee, you really, the reward really goes to the best team player. And so it's not necessarily the smartest, but it's the one who works the best with others and should focus on being the best listener in the room and help others shine in meetings and committees, which, is almost the opposite of what you learn to do in graduate school. But this is quite helpful for the workforce. And so with that, I just want to conclude and just say thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll take any questions if there's time for that.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Luna. That was wonderful, and I really appreciate you sharing some of the what we call the softer skills that are really important when you get a professional position, and in particular in science communication. And as you said, a lot of times in graduate school, you learn to, more to be the best and not be a team player. And so we really appreciate you bringing that up. We do have one question here that I think we'll take, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next speaker. And that question is, can you give a few examples of job opportunities? The question is, besides the ability to multitask and work in a team, what other skills are vital?
Pardon me, I didn't hear the last. There was a bit of an echo on my end.
Yeah, so besides the ability to multitask and work in a team, what other skills are vital for a career in scientific communication?
I think a lot of times I do spend, you think the scientific communication is all output, but there's also a lot of input. And so I mentioned what I've really learned and what's really practical is to be a really good listener. So whether I'm working with individuals improving their story, it has to start with listening. Working on a committee, just listening, which And I think that is a skill that you really have to work on. Some of you may be experts at it, but coming out of grad school, um, you're taught that, to buck the trend or to, find a new paradigm. So even though you might hear something, a research field, but you still want to explore that yourself. But I think here in the field of scientific communication and whatever aspect that you do with that, I think listening is a key skill that should be utilized, and also developed. And that's a great question, by the way.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so we will go ahead and continue on, and I am ready to introduce our next panelist, who will be Tiffany Dickerson, who's a primary patent examiner in the Operations Research and Analysis ARC unit at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So Ms. Dickerson serves as the primary patent examiner, and she renders patentable decisions on inventions related to resource allocation and planning, workflow analysis, market forecasting, analysis and modeling, and strategic management. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from Mississippi State University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Mississippi Law School. She's registered to practice before the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, inactive during employment, and is also a member of the Maryland Bar. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Dickerson. So due to some technical issues today, we won't see a video of her, but we will hear her as she presents her slides. So we can go ahead and go to her slides and get started on the presentation.
Thank you. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you about non-traditional STEM careers in patent law. So in my first slides, I will provide an overview of the U.S. patent system and why it's important. I will discuss the life cycle of a patent and the invention process from the inventor's spark of creativity and on. Then, once you're familiar with the various stages of a patent, I will discuss various careers in patent law and how they relate to those stages. So, next slide. So, intellectual property, what is it? So, intellectual property is the product of human creativity, which is protected by law. Examples include inventions, literary and artistic works, designs, symbols, names and images used in commerce, such as trademarks. But I'm going to talk to you today about patents. A patent for an invention is the grant of property right to an inventor. To get more specific, it is the right to exclude others from making, using, offering for sale, or selling, or even importing the invention into the United States. So why is this important? Congress has been charged under the Constitution to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So in exchange for granting inventors this right to exclude others from practicing their inventions for a time, the inventor must adequately describe their inventions in their applications to share that knowledge with the public and spur on further innovation. Next slide. Traditionally, when we talk about patent law, people would usually talk about it from the aspect of prosecution or litigation. So just to give you an overview of that, patent prosecution involves the life of the patent from filing the application all the way to granting the application or otherwise disposing of the application by abandonment. This whole process happens at the Patent and Trademark Office. Litigation, on the other hand, includes actions that occur, for instance, in the federal courts. Like, for instance, when that patentee wants to enforce the right to exclude someone from making or using their invention. And so we'd call that a patent infringement action. So that's an example of litigation. Next slide. So I've given you the traditional, how we look at the patent system, but today I'm going to talk to you about careers in terms of patent stages, where at the preparation of a patent, the prosecution of the patent, and then the litigation of a patent. So I think this is a helpful way to look at patent careers. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So a patent examiner examines applications and grants patents for inventions when you basically decide when an application should be granted a patent. And so obviously this is on the public side, and so a patent examiner is going to be within the prosecution part of the timeline. Patent agents and attorneys represent an inventor on the private side. They represent the inventor on all matters before the agency. And that also is going to require registrations of practice, but I'll talk about that in a later slide. Searchers work either on the agency side or in the private sector, searching relevant prior publications or patents to verify the novelty of an invention. And so part of my work as an examiner is searching, and then we also have sort of expert searchers for when we have especially tough problems looking at an application. So we have our own searchers who we can kind of outsource to. And then on the in private industry, there's searchers who work at law firms, or there's agencies that are firms that searching is all they do. There's also classifiers who work within the agency in sort of a pre-processing capacity. They review applications as soon as they come into the office and sort of decide what we call them art units. So what department an application will be reviewed in once in the agency. There are administrative law judges, which they come at the post-grant part on the timeline. They work at the patent trial and appeals board when it's sort of an agency level judge who hears appeals from adverse examiner decisions and also other post-grant proceedings. So when I'll move on. I don't want to take up too much time on that. Also, you have IP attaché and IP policy types of workers who deal with overarching patent policy and law for domestic and international patent matters. And that's a really interesting job area because you get to affect legislation and policy, which we've kind of touched on in some of the earlier talks, but from a IP standpoint. And then there's the technology specialist who aids in communication for the technical requirements of the invention to ensure that for instance, attorney who's filing the application or agent who's filing an application for an inventor fully understands. I like how Dr. Zitler said it before. She said that to make sure that the two people in the room are having the right conversation. It's sort of the same thing a technology specialist might do in a law firm. If there's a particularly difficult application or subject matter, that person will act as a expert to help in understanding for filing the application and taking advantage of the level of detail that needs to be taken in the application. Sometimes a technology specialist might also work as a expert witness in litigation. So a technology specialist would sort of the entire timeline from preparation, prosecution, and post-grant. You know, they have their hands in each part. So to take a step back and look at this from the timeline standpoint or the patent stages standpoint, an examiner, agent, or attorney might deal, well, not an examiner, but an agent or attorney deals with the preparation of the application. And then during prosecution, you might, the examiner or patent agent, attorney, searchers, classifiers, and technology specialists would work during the prosecution stage. And then in the post-grant or litigation stage, you have the patent attorneys, administrative law judges, technology specialists. And also, I didn't mention the tech transfer specialist who works with commercializing the patent after grant, well, after it's actually issued, actually helping the patentee make money off of their hard work. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I'm just highlighting that the patent attorney and the administrative law judge has extra credentials that they would need, a law degree, obviously, or they have to be registered or licensed to practice law. And also the patent agent, attorney, and the administrative law judge would require a registration to practice before the USPTO, which leads to my next question: who can sit for the registration exam? Next slide, please. So I've included a list of majors that are recognized as being able to sit for the patent bar to start a field in the patent industry, but there are many exceptions to this list. An applicant generally to sit for the patent bar, you just have to demonstrate that you possess scientific and technical training necessary to represent patent applicants. And people do that by a host of ways. There's more information on the USPTO's website, which is the next slide. There's a host of information on the USPTO.gov internet site talking about how to become a patent practitioner and what it takes to sit for the exam. And next slide. There's also student programs, which are publicized more than they were when I started at the office. You really couldn't find any information on these before, but there's been a whole lot more information about them lately, where high school students, college students, there's externships and programs for students to come out and get early understanding of the patent system and how it works. It's a niche area, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily choose the patent field because they don't really know what it takes to enter the field. There's a lot of people think you have to have a law degree. You don't. And then the last slide is just going back to the list of careers for question's sake, if just to aid with any questions anyone might have about the careers I spoke on. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that presentation. It was really interesting. I had no idea that there were so many different roles in patent law in the Career Center. So that was really helpful for you. So please, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them into the question box and we will get to them. While we're waiting, I'll just want to put the other panelists on alert. We have a few questions that we hadn't gotten to, so we may call on you to answer some questions. So if you want to go ahead and kind of get yourself ready to answer questions, that will be fine while we're waiting for these questions to come in. And while we're doing that, I will go ahead and ask a question that was asked for Dr. Zitler. There was a question that came in. Is it given that, sorry, here, let me get this question here. There was a question about what were the appropriate conferences or workshops for networking if someone was interested in getting into policy work. You're on mute right now, so we can't hear you.
There we go. So that's a great question. I think that most of my experiences with getting into science policy were not necessarily conference related. So for example, I pursued activities that other grad students were leading around energy policy conversations. And I said, hey, can I give a talk at this meeting that you guys have, once a month? And they said, sure. Or some of them were conferences. So I just looked out for opportunities where people were hosting conference activities where you could provide a scientific perspective at a conference that was about science relevant policy. That's how things kind of came up for me the most. And it tended to be associated with other activities, like I said. So I was in an NSF IGERT fellowship that was about science policy, and they had a conference. We also invited a number of speakers who could give interesting perspectives on science that was relevant to policy. So it wasn't a whole lot of policy presentations. It was mostly science relevant to policy. And that allowed me to become conversant in those topics and to have some things, frankly, to put on my CV as well.
I have a question for you, Tiffany. There's a question that came in. Do patent examiners require any additional education beyond a BS, MS, or a PhD in a scientific field?
No, actually, a patent examiner, you can do the job as having a Bachelor of Science. However, that would limit the type of application you would look at. I have colleagues who have up to PhD, law degrees, all kinds of things. They because of course, if you're examining a really high level subject where you have to have a PhD to understand, that's the type of resource they would put on that type of application. And so there's a wide range of education levels working at the USPTO as examiners. Okay. And even, I was just going to say, even, after you've worked, they have master's levels certifications where you go even higher in the certain art units or your technical field, they even further training. So there's just a wide variety.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. One more question for you. What about science and public affairs and trademark? What's the path look like that for someone?
For public affairs, I will tell you, a lot of people who work in those areas at the office started as examiners. That's not a requirement, but it just helps. It helps that the office sort of from the ground up. So a lot of people who work over on the legal side, or mostly everyone has, or many people working have held the examiner position at some point in their careers, but that's not a requirement. On the trademark side, a law degree is required. A STEM background is not required.
Great, thank you so much. Well, in the interest of time, I think we're going to try to summarize here, but let me just mention, I know that there are several questions that we unfortunately didn't get to. Don't worry about that. We will send all those questions to the panelists and distribute answers. So if you have more questions, please go ahead and feel free to put them in there. So I'm just going to take a minute to summarize briefly what we learned today. In terms of the regulatory work, we learned that what's really required is technical expertise, written and oral communication, as well as time management skills. And a few myths about the regulatory work is that regulatory positions are boring. Hardly from that. I think you saw from Dr. Whatley that she actually has very exciting work and can really contribute to the better of society in her role. Another myth is that you don't use scientific training, but absolutely you can see she's using a lot of science and a lot of her biological training in the work that she's doing. Another myth is that it's impossible to get regulatory jobs. Obviously, she's gotten one, and she shared with you some of the ways that you can position yourself if you are interested in getting into a regulatory career. For the science policy, I think that was a very interesting presentation, as they all were. And what we learned was that science policy actually requires participation from people both inside and outside of the government. It also requires that you do have scientific expertise, and plenty of it seems, as well as having an understanding for how policy processes work. So clearly you have to understand the government and how it works and how policy is established and implemented. Policy work has both short-term and long-term capacities. And through the policy work, the work will set goals for funding and running of programs, scientific programs, as well as provide informed advice to create policy. For science communication, we got to learn that storytelling is key to the scientific communication and administrative leadership positions, and that it's really about a narrative process that includes a protagonist, an antagonist, conflict, a scene, and resolution and stakes. So it's really nice to see how Dr. Luna broke out some very technical scientific information and identified those components of it, the protagonist, the antagonist as well. So it's really nice to think of it in the humanities perspective of, how do you tell a story? And last but not least, we heard about patent law, this very interesting area, and how it combines both scientific and legal expertise. And some of the most important things for being successful in the patent law area are both written and oral communication, time management, as well as investigative skills and a curiosity. There's a variety of patent-related careers, both in the public and private sectors, and there are many paths associated with how to get into these fields. So a few more remarks just as far as next steps. We did get a few questions about this. We will be sending out a follow-up email, and in that email there'll be a link to a post survey, so a post-webinar survey. Please complete that so we can get your input on future topics. If you enjoyed this webinar, we'd love to get your input on what other kinds of topics you'd like to hear about. There will also be a link to the webinar recording, as well as all the slides that were presented by the panelists. and any resources that were provided by the panelists. And speaking of resources, there's a great resource already on the AAAS website that's shown here on the Science Careers area. So definitely, as you're exploring careers, go out to the website and see what kind of resources are out there. There's lots and lots of resources. The Emerging Research National Conference program staff who are behind this webinar and the webinar series are Yolanda George, who is the Deputy Director of the Education and Human Resources, and she is the Principal Investigator for the ERN National Conference. And Iris Wagstaff, who is the STEM Program Director who works on the ERN program, and then Quincy Brown, who's a Program Director for the STEM Education and Research area. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar. I hope it was very useful for you, and we look forward to your attendance at a future webinar. And be sure to complete your surveys after the program, and look for an email with all of these great resources. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.